monitoring a dangerous situation developing in Washington state. At least 6 rivers.
Hurricane Melissa is now a dangerous Category 5 storm with winds.
Wildfires that outran evacuation orders, floods that carved new canyons overnight, blizzards that buried entire towns under 20-foot drifts, avalanches that fell with the force of a bomb, silent and absolute. This is the history of Colorado, a story written not in textbooks, but on the land itself. It is a state defined by its profound relationship with elevation, where majestic beauty and imminent danger are two sides of the same unforgiving coin. You think you know what a natural disaster looks like. You don't. Stay through number 4. The people who were there say the sky didn't just rain, it broke. We begin with number 12. March 17th, 2003. A date that lingers in the memory of Colorado's Front Range and eastern plains. The storm began not with a roar, but with a deceptive gentleness, a spring snow that many initially dismissed. But meteorologists watching their screens saw something else. They saw a bomb cyclone, a phenomenon where atmospheric pressure plummets at an explosive rate, creating a vortex of terrifying storm energy. For 3 days, a blizzard of historic scale seized and paralyzed the state. The gleaming modern hub of Denver International Airport, a symbol of all-weather efficiency, was rendered useless. Over 4,000 travelers were stranded inside, watching the drifts pile up against the terminal windows. The snow itself was a betrayer. It wasn't the light, dry powder that fuels the state's ski industry. It was wet, heavy, and dense, with the consistency of concrete. It fell at relentless rates of 3 to 5 inches per hour, driven sideways by winds that gusted over 60 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions even in the heart of the city. This weight was a structural assassin. Across the metro area, the groans of stressed steel gave way to the sharp crack of collapse. In Evergreen, the roof of a Safeway caved in. In Aurora, it was a Sam's Club. By sheer luck, these collapses happened at night, and the buildings were empty. The true heart of the tragedy unfolded on the vast, open expanse of the eastern plains. The blizzard struck squarely during calving season, the most vulnerable time for ranchers. They were powerless, watching from their homes as hundreds of thousands of cattle, the lifeblood of the regional economy, were buried alive in massive drifts or simply froze to death where they stood. The final snow totals were a testament to the storm's power. Denver officially recorded 27 inches. Boulder received 32, but in the foothills the numbers became astronomical. Fritz Peak, an observation point near Rawlinsville, was crushed under an incredible 87 inches. More than 7 feet of snow in 72 hours. The storm's insured cost, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $200 million, but the agricultural losses pushed the real figure far higher. It was a brutal reminder that in Colorado, the greatest and most primitive threat can still emerge from its most famous and celebrated feature. Winter isn't just a season, it's a sovereign force. June 26, 2012, a date etched into the landscape of Colorado Springs and the memory of its residents. The fire began in Waldo Canyon, a beloved recreational area, a place for weekend hikes and family picnics. For the first few days, it was a distant problem, a dramatic plume of smoke against the majestic backdrop of Pikes Peak. Residents watched it with a kind of detached concern. Fire officials issued pre-evacuation notices for the westernmost neighborhoods, but offered public assurances. Fire breaks had been cut. The city, they insisted, was safe. The assurances were built on a fatal misunderstanding of the enemy. On the afternoon of June 27th, the weather broke. A dry, cold front swept down from the north, and the winds became erratic, violent, and hot. They gusted to 65 miles per hour, and the fire, which had been creeping along the ground, exploded. It transformed into a firestorm. It made a run of 4 miles in less than an hour, leaping across containment lines as if they weren't there. It roared down the canyons and slammed into the northwestern suburbs of the city. The full evacuation order for 32,000 people came at the worst possible moment, the middle of afternoon rush hour. The scene descended into primal chaos. Highways became parking lots as a wall of flame, hundreds of feet high, descended on the Mountain Shadows neighborhood. The radiant heat was so intense it melted car frames into puddles of aluminum and warped the steel beams of houses. Survivor accounts speak of a deafening roar, a sound like a freight train and a waterfall combined. The winds, now superheated by the fire itself, were strong enough to rip the siding off houses. They drove embers the size of dinner plates miles ahead of the main fire front, starting hundreds of new spot fires deep inside the city's grid. Firefighters who had battled blazes for decades described it as a living entity, an event that was creating its own weather, its own lightning, its own rules. By the time it was finally contained weeks later, the Waldo Canyon fire had burned over 18,000 acres, a relatively small footprint. But its path had been surgical. It destroyed 346 homes, making it the state's most destructive fire in history at the time. It killed an elderly couple, William and Barbara Everett, in their home. The cost was over $450 million in 2012 dollars, nearly $630 million today. The burn scar it left on the mountainside was a gaping black wound. It was also a warning. The next time the heavy rains came, there would be nothing left to hold the earth in place. May 19th, 1864, the nascent city of Denver. It was little more than a rough-hewn settlement, a collection of log cabins, saloons, and false-fronted stores sprawling across a floodplain at the confluence of Cherry Creek and the South Platte River. It was a city built on ambition and ignorance. The Arapaho people, who had inhabited the area for generations, had tried to warn the white settlers. They never camped near the creek bed. They called it the Camp of the Flash Flood. The settlers, brimming with the confidence of manifest destiny, dismissed the warnings as native superstition. They built their most important structures: City Hall, the Rocky Mountain News Building, the Methodist Church, just feet from the dry, sandy banks of the creek. On the evening of May 19th, a series of massive thunderstorms formed in the mountains 60 miles to the south, near the headwaters of Cherry Creek. A deluge of historic proportions fell on the Palmer Divide. A wall of water, described by a survivor as a rolling, churning mass of logs, uprooted trees, and debris, began its journey toward the unsuspecting town. The only warning was a lone horseman, a rancher named W.T. Smith, who had seen the wave coming and galloped ahead of it, shouting for people to flee. He arrived only minutes before the flood. It was too late. The flood hit Denver just after midnight, a black wave in the moonless night. The water rose 15 feet in as many minutes. It did not just flood the town, it dismantled it. It ripped entire buildings from their foundations and carried them away like toys. The Rocky Mountain News Building was one of the first to go, its staff barely scrambling to safety with the city's official records. The city jail was destroyed, its prisoners swept away to their deaths. By dawn, the entire commercial and civic heart of Denver was simply gone. At least 15 people were confirmed killed, a significant percentage of the town's small population, though the true number was likely higher. Nearly every bridge in the region was destroyed. The financial loss was estimated at $1 million in 1864, the equivalent of wiping out the entire city's accumulated wealth. It was Denver's first great disaster. In the aftermath, a debate ensued. Some wanted to abandon the site, but the lure of the gold rush was too strong. They rebuilt, but this time they built farther from the creek bed. They had finally listened to the warning. It only took the complete and utter destruction of their city to finally hear it. June 3rd, 1921. Pueblo, the industrial heart of Colorado. Known as the Pittsburgh of the West, it was a booming steel town built with a dangerous optimism along the wide, flat banks of the Arkansas River. Much like Denver, its placement was a gamble against nature. In the days leading up to the disaster, the weather reports from upstream had been clear. Heavy, persistent rain saturating the mountain watershed. No one in Pueblo paid much attention. The river had flooded before, a regular spring occurrence, but it had never been catastrophic. Complacency was the city's unofficial policy. The warnings were there, stark and increasingly frantic. On the evening of June 3rd, telegraph operators upriver in towns like Canyon City began sending desperate messages. A cloudburst had dumped more than 9 inches of rain in a few hours. The river was rising at an unprecedented rate, a foot every 10 minutes. The messages were received, but they were either ignored or disastrously downplayed by local officials who feared causing a panic. Just after 8 p.m., the panic arrived on its own. A 10-foot wall of water hit the city, followed by a second, larger wave, an astonishing 25 feet high, carrying the wreckage of bridges and buildings it had consumed upstream. The floodwaters, black and viscous with oil, grease, and industrial chemicals from the rail yards, slammed into the downtown area. The force was sufficient to derail a Denver and Rio Grande passenger train, drowning many of those on board in the murky water. Then, the flood became an inferno. Ruptured gas lines ignited, and fires broke out across the surface of the water, turning the flood into a floating, fiery hellscape. The official death toll was listed as 120. Historians, however, argue the true number was much higher, potentially exceeding 1,500 people. A large population of itinerant and immigrant workers lived in shanty towns along the riverbank. They were swept away without a trace, their deaths never recorded. The flood destroyed a third of the city's businesses and left thousands homeless. The cost was $19 million in 1921, over $350 million in today's money. In the aftermath, Pueblo undertook a monumental feat of engineering. They moved the entire channel of the Arkansas River half a mile to the south. The old riverbed was transformed into a park and a memorial. The risk had not been eliminated. It had just been relocated, a multi-million-dollar admission that the city had been built in the wrong place. January 21st, 1962. A date that marks a fundamental shift in Colorado's relationship with its most iconic hazard. Avalanches are a constant silent threat in the high country, a risk accepted by those who live and travel there. But what happened on that Sunday near Twin Lakes was an event of a different magnitude. A massive slab avalanche, triggered by heavy snowfall and high winds, released from the slopes of Mount Elbert, the state's highest peak. It wasn't just snow, it was a fluid, unstoppable mass of snow, rock, and ancient trees, traveling at speeds estimated to exceed 100 miles per hour. Its target was a small highway maintenance depot located on the shores of Twin Lakes, directly in the avalanche's historical runout zone. The slide was so powerful it generated an invisible air blast in front of it, a wave of pure pressure strong enough to shatter windows and knock people off their feet before the snow even arrived. The avalanche obliterated the depot and a section of Highway 82, burying them under 30 feet of debris as hard as concrete. 7 people were killed. A highway worker named Chester San Patril, who was operating a rotary plow, was buried and killed instantly. An entire family of 4, the Johnsons, were swept away in their car while waiting for the plow. A survivor, a truck driver who was blown hundreds of feet by the air blast, later told rescuers, "The whole mountain just seemed to come apart." This event served as a brutal catalyst. It exposed the state's inadequate understanding of avalanche dynamics and forecasting. It led directly to the expansion and empowerment of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, or CAIC, which would become the first and most advanced public avalanche forecasting program in the United States. The CAIC began to use military artillery, firing 75mm and 105mm howitzers into the slopes to preemptively trigger slides in high-risk areas, a practice that continues to this day. The 1962 Twin Lakes avalanche didn't just take lives. It created a science. It forced the state to acknowledge that you cannot just live in the mountains. You must listen to them, and you must understand their every move. This channel is documenting the history nature tries to erase in every state. We are building a library of what has been forgotten. Subscribe so you don't miss the entry for yours. October 4th, 1884. Near the Alpine Tunnel in the heart of the Sawatch Range. The late 19th century was the era of the railroad barons in Colorado. Competing lines waged a war of engineering, racing to build tracks over and through the highest mountains to reach the lucrative silver and gold mines. The Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railway embarked on one of the most ambitious and foolhardy projects of all, the Alpine Tunnel. At an elevation of 11,523 feet, it was the highest railroad tunnel in the world, a marvel of Gilded Age engineering, blasted through 2,000 feet of solid granite at the spine of the Continental Divide. But the men who built it, mostly Irish and Swedish immigrants, faced a more powerful and patient force than granite. On that October morning, a massive avalanche released from the slopes high above. Its target was the small, makeshift community at the western portal of the tunnel, where workers lived in flimsy wooden boarding houses. The slide, comprised of early-season wet snow, fell with the weight of a glacier. It obliterated the settlement. It buried an entire train, a rotary snowplow, and the workers' quarters under tons of snow and splintered timber. The snow set like concrete. Rescue efforts were immediate but tragically futile. The location was one of the most remote in the state, and the slide had buried the only rail line in. It took days for rescue crews to even reach the site on foot. They tunneled through the snow, a desperate search for survivors in a tomb of ice. They found only bodies, frozen in their final moments. The official death toll was listed as 13 men, but historical accounts and workers' diaries suggest the number was closer to 23. The railroad company, its focus squarely on profits and its public image, deliberately downplayed the tragedy. A Gunnison newspaper article from the time, likely fed by the company, reads, "The accident, while deplorable, will not seriously delay the progress of the line." The tunnel itself proved to be a financial and logistical nightmare, constantly plagued by rockfalls and impassable winter conditions. It was abandoned in 1910, just 20 years after it was completed. Today, the collapsed western portal is a ghost story, a monument to misplaced ambition and a tomb for the men who paid for that ambition with their lives. Their deaths were treated as a cost of doing business. September 9th, 2013. A disaster that unfolded not in minutes, but over a week, drowning a 17-county area of the Colorado Front Range. It began with a period of strange tropical rain, a plume of monsoonal moisture, a weather pattern usually confined to the desert southwest, was drawn north and stalled directly over Colorado's mountains. Then, on September 9th, the sky opened. For 7 consecutive days, the rain did not stop. It wasn't a single, violent cloudburst, but a relentless, soaking atmospheric river. The city of Boulder received 9.08 inches of rain in a single 24-hour period, shattering its previous all-time record and nearly equaling its average annual rainfall. The ground, already saturated from the preceding days, could not absorb another drop. The result was not one flood, but hundreds of them. Creeks and rivers across a region the size of the state of Connecticut erupted from their banks simultaneously. The scale was biblical. The Big Thompson and St. Vrain rivers, the same drainages that had caused catastrophic devastation before, raged again, this time with enough force to wash away entire sections of U.S. highways and completely isolate mountain towns like Estes Park and Lyons. In Lyons, the St. Vrain River split its channel, carving a new path through the center of town and turning it into an island for days. Yet this disaster was different. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. Sophisticated warning systems, born from the tragedy of the Big Thompson flood, worked. People had time to evacuate. The death toll, 9 people, was miraculously low given the scale of the inundation. The destruction of property, however, was immense. The flood destroyed or damaged nearly 20,000 homes. It washed out over 200 miles of state highways and obliterated 400 bridges. The economic cost was a staggering $4 billion, one of the costliest disasters in American history. The 2013 flood fundamentally reshaped both the landscape and the state's approach to disaster management. It demonstrated that a disaster didn't have to be a single, violent event. It could be a slow, quiet drowning, and it left a treacherous legacy. The mountainsides, now stripped of soil and vegetation, were primed for the next phase of disaster. The burn scars from previous fires became chutes for deadly mudslides. The 2001-3 flood wasn't an end. It was a setup. The 1930s, a decade-long catastrophe that visited eastern Colorado. There were no flames, no floodwaters. This disaster arrived silently, on the wind, and it was entirely of our own making. For decades, the southern Great Plains, including the southeastern quadrant of Colorado, had been aggressively overfarmed. Lured by the false promise of rain follows the plow and a period of unusually wet weather, farmers had plowed up millions of acres of native shortgrass prairie. This grass, with its ancient, intricate root system, was the only thing holding the fragile topsoil in place against the relentless prairie wind. When a severe, multi-year drought began in 1930, the exposed soil, now pulverized into a fine powder by mechanical plows, had nothing to hold it. And then the wind came. The people who lived through it called them black blizzards. These were not dust storms. They were rolling, 1,000-foot-high clouds of topsoil, so dense they blotted out the sun at midday, turning day into a terrifying dark twilight. They carried enough static electricity to short out car engines and cause eerie blue flames to dance on barbed wire fences. The dust was a malevolent, inescapable presence. It seeped through every crack in every window and door, coating every surface, every plate of food, every bed sheet in a fine, gritty film. Housewives hung wet sheets over windows in a futile attempt to trap it. It was useless. People, especially children and the elderly, developed dust pneumonia, a debilitating respiratory illness caused by inhaling the silicate-laden particles. Children wore masks to school. Livestock suffocated in the fields, their lungs caked with mud. The human and economic toll was apocalyptic. In Baca County, Colorado, one of the hardest-hit areas, 60% of the population simply gave up and fled, becoming part of the great Okie migration to California. their plight immortalized by John Steinbeck. The federal government finally intervened, creating the Soil Conservation Service. It was a massive New Deal project that paid farmers to plant trees as windbreaks and to return vast swaths of the plains to native grass. The Dust Bowl was a man-made natural disaster, a brutal lesson in ecology taught at the cost of a generation. It proved that the deadliest weapon in nature's arsenal isn't always fire or water. Sometimes it's just dirt and wind, mobilized by human greed and ignorance. June 8, 2002, a date that marks the beginning of the largest wildfire in Colorado's recorded history. Its origin was not a bolt of lightning or a downed power line. It was an act of personal despair. A United States Forest Service fire prevention officer named Terry Barton, in violation of a total burn ban she was tasked with enforcing, went to a campfire ring in the Pike National Forest near Lake George. She was distraught over her estranged husband. She lit one of his letters on fire. The fire escaped the ring and ignited the tinder-dry forest floor. That small private act of anger began the Hayman Fire. Barton later claimed she had tried to put the fire out, but a federal investigation revealed she had lied to authorities, changing her story multiple times. While investigators sorted out the truth, the fire, fueled by a historic drought and driven by high winds, exploded across the landscape. For 20 days, it burned with a ferocity that stunned even the most seasoned firefighters. It ultimately consumed 138,000 acres, an area larger than the city of Denver. At its peak, it created pyrocumulus clouds that reached 45,000 feet into the atmosphere, generating their own internal weather systems, complete with lightning and violent, unpredictable winds. The smoke plume was visible from the International Space Station. The fire advanced not as a single line, but in a vast V-shape, a 30-mile-wide front of flame that moved so quickly it overran fire crews and jumped highways. It destroyed 133 homes and 466 other structures. The human cost included 5 firefighters, members of an Oregon-based crew, who were killed in a traffic accident on their way to the fire line. The cost of suppression alone was over $40 million in 2002, but the true cost was astronomical. The total economic impact, including property loss, long-term erosion, and damage to the Denver metropolitan area's watershed, was estimated to be well over $1 billion in today's money. Terry Barton was eventually sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to pay millions in restitution she would never be able to afford. The Hayman Fire was a landmark disaster, not just for its colossal size, but for its intimate human origin. It was a stark and painful reminder that the most unpredictable and dangerous element in any forest isn't the weather. It is, and always will be, human behavior. Nature does not have a memory. We do. The canyons and forests of Colorado are scarred with the physical and psychological reminders of what happens when that memory is ignored or when profit is prioritized over prudence. The fundamental forces that shaped these disasters, the steep terrain, the volatile weather, the human desire to live in beautiful but dangerous places, have not changed. In fact, they have been amplified. A changing climate is loading the dice, promising more intense wildfires, more extreme rainfall events, and a deeper, more persistent drought. The burn scars from one year's fires become the deadly mudslide paths of the next. The lessons from the Big Thompson flood, the Hayman Fire, and the Dust Bowl are not inert artifacts of history. They are active, urgent warnings for the future. The question is not if a disaster of this magnitude will happen again in Colorado. The question is when, and whether the lessons that were paid for in lives and fortunes have been truly learned or merely archived. If you want the stories that are more than just weather reports, the deep histories that the news cycle skips, subscribe. Every state has a list like this one. Some are longer than you'd expect. Nature does not learn from its past. It only repeats it. We are the only ones who can break the cycle. The test is whether we are listening to the echoes in the canyons.